The year is 1957, November 13th, to be exact. In a dimly lit Italian restaurant hidden away on Mulberry Street in Little Italy. The air is heavy with cigar smoke and the smell of garlic and red wine through the frosted windows. The light from street lamps creates long shadows across the stone streets. Inside, men in dark suits speak quietly. Their words carry the importance of empires, tomorrow. Many of these men will travel upstate to a small town called Appalachian to a meeting that will change everything. They don't know it yet, but the golden age is already starting to fade. The walls have ears. The FBI is watching. And the Cosa Nostra, this thing of ours, will never be the same in the shadows of New York City. 5 families controlled everything. Politics, unions, construction, the waterfront. The streets themselves, they built an empire from nothing, rising from the poverty of Italian immigration to command billions of dollars and influence that reached the highest levels of American society. This is the true story of how Italian immigrants built America's most powerful criminal organization and how it all came crashing down. This is the story of the 5 families. Before we go into the shadows of La Cosa Nostra, let us know where in the world you are watching from. What time is it where you are? Drop your location in the comments below. And if you're ready for the complete story of America's most powerful crime organization, hit that subscribe button, give us a like, and share this with anyone who enjoys true crime history. Now let's begin at the beginning. To understand the 5 families, we must first travel across the Atlantic Ocean to the sun-baked hills of Sicily in the late 1800s. There, in the shadows of Mount Etna, a code was born that would shape organized crime in America for generations to come. They called it Omerta, the Code of Silence, a sacred promise that demanded absolute loyalty and forbid cooperation with authorities under penalty of death. Sicily in the 1800s was a land of large estates and terrible poverty. The official government held little real power in the countryside. Instead, local strongmen, men of respect they were called, settled disputes, collected debts, and enforced their own brutal justice. These men formed the original Mafia, from the Sicilian word meaning boldness or swagger. They were not outlaws in their own eyes, but men of honor maintaining order in a lawless land. When these men looked at the corrupt politicians and wealthy landowners who took advantage of the peasants, they saw an opportunity. Protection became their business. Pay us and we'll make sure your crops aren't burned, your livestock isn't stolen, your family isn't harmed. Of course, the threat was understood. The protection was often from the very men offering it. By the 1870s and 1880s, poverty and political problems drove millions of Italians to seek new lives across the ocean. Between 1880 and 1920, more than 4 million Italians came to the United States. Most were honest, hardworking people seeking only to build better lives for their families. They gathered in close neighborhoods in American cities. Little Italy in Manhattan, East Harlem, South Brooklyn. They brought their language, their customs, their food, and their festivals. But some brought something else. Some brought the old ways, some brought Omerta. The first Italian criminals in America were rough and unsophisticated. In the 1890s and early 1900s, a wave of blackmail swept through Italian immigrant communities. Letters arrived at homes and businesses decorated with drawings of black hands, daggers or skulls. The message was always the same: pay us or face the consequences. Sometimes the threats were signed La Mano Nera, the Black Hand. These were not organized groups, but rather loose collections of thugs preying on their own people. The victims, fresh from Sicily and southern Italy, had been raised to distrust police. Omerta kept them silent. They paid. One name rose above the others in these early years: Ignazio Lupo, known as Lupo the Wolf, born in Sicily in 1877. Lupo came to New York in 1898 after reportedly killing a man back home. He was a counterfeiter and murderer who controlled much of the Italian lottery and blackmail rackets in East Harlem. His brother-in-law, Giuseppe Morello, was equally ruthless. Together, the Morello Lupo gang became the first important Italian organized crime family in New York. The Morello family's headquarters was a saloon at 8 Prince Street in Manhattan's Little Italy. From there, they ran counterfeiting operations so good that the Secret Service made them a top priority. In 1910, Lupo and Morello were convicted of counterfeiting and sent to federal prison in Atlanta. But their organization didn't die, it simply evolved. When Prohibition arrived in 1920, everything changed on January 17, 1920. The 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution went into effect, prohibiting the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages. The Volstead Act, passed to enforce the amendment, was supposed to improve public morality and reduce crime. Instead, it created the greatest criminal opportunity in American history. Americans wanted to drink. The law said they couldn't. The gap between law and desire created a vacuum. And into that vacuum rushed every ambitious criminal in the country. Irish gangsters, Jewish mobsters, and Italian bootleggers all saw the same golden opportunity. Whoever could supply illegal alcohol would become rich beyond imagination. The Italian gangs in New York had an advantage. Connections back in Sicily and southern Italy, where winemaking was a centuries-old tradition. They knew how to make alcohol, how to ship it, how to hide it. More importantly, they had the discipline and organizational structure that the Black Hand extortionists had lacked. Giuseppe Joe, the boss Masseria, emerged as the most powerful Italian gangster in New York during the early Prohibition years. Born in Sicily in 1886, Masseria came to New York in 1903. He was physically imposing, short but massively built. With a round face and cold eyes, he had survived multiple murder attempts, earning a reputation for being lucky or blessed. By the mid-1920s, Masseria controlled much of the bootlegging, gambling, and extortion in Manhattan and Brooklyn. He lived lavishly, dining at the finest restaurants in Little Italy, always surrounded by bodyguards. He was a traditional Sicilian boss, a mustache Pete, as the younger generation dismissively called the old world gangsters. He believed power came from fear and violence. He distrusted innovation and rejected the idea of working with non-Italians. But a new generation was rising, and they had different ideas about how organized crime should operate. Charles Lucky Luciano was born Salvatore Lucchese in Sicily in 1897. His family came to New York in 1906, settling in Manhattan's Lower East Side. Young Salvatore immediately encountered the harsh realities of immigrant life, poverty, prejudice, and violence. He dropped out of school at 14 and fell in with street gangs. But Luciano was different from the old-style gangsters. He was ambitious, intelligent, and most importantly, he understood that the future belonged to those who could think beyond old ethnic prejudices. While still a teenager, he formed a friendship with Meyer Lansky, a brilliant young Jewish gangster. The two became lifelong partners, proving that organized crime could go beyond ethnic boundaries. Luciano got his famous nickname after a near-fatal beating in 1929. Rival gangsters kidnapped him, slashed his face with a knife, and left him for dead. He survived, his face bearing permanent scars. And the underworld began calling him Lucky. The name stuck. By the late 1920s, Luciano had become one of Joe Masseria's top men. But he grew frustrated under the old boss's leadership. Masseria was making enemies through his greed and his refusal to work with non-Italian criminals. Luciano saw that Prohibition had created opportunities for cooperation between different ethnic gangs, Italian, Jewish, Irish, but Masseria's old-world prejudices prevented profitable alliances. Another young gangster shared Luciano's frustrations. Frank Castelot, born Francesco Castiglia in Calabria, Italy in 1891, had come to New York as a child. Handsome and smooth-talking, Coslo was the opposite of the crude Mafia. He wore expensive suits, built relationships with politicians and judges, and believed that bribery was more effective than bullets. His nickname would eventually become the Prime Minister of the underworld because of his political connections. There was also Vito Genovese, born in Naples in 1897. Unlike the diplomatic Coslo, Genovese was a brutal killer who enjoyed violence. He had worked his way up through Mafia's organization through sheer ruthlessness. He was cunning, paranoid, and absolutely merciless toward enemies. These young gangsters, Luciano, Coslo, Genovese, and others, came to be known as the Young Turks. They studied the Prohibition-era success of non-Italian criminals like Arnold Rothstein, the Jewish mastermind who had fixed the 1919 World Series. They saw how Chicago's Johnny Torrio had organized that city's underworld along business lines. They understood that the future of organized crime lay in cooperation, organization, and reducing unnecessary violence that attracted law enforcement attention. But Joe Mafia stood in their way. If Mafia represented the old Sicilian ways, Salvatore Maranzano was even more traditional and far more dangerous. Born in 1886 in Castellammare del Golfo, Sicily, Maranzano had actually studied for the priesthood before turning to crime. He was educated, spoke perfect English, and had an obsession with ancient Roman history. He saw himself as a modern-day Julius Caesar, and he came to America with ambitions to rule. Maranzano arrived in New York in 1925 and quickly established himself as a bootlegger and narcotics trafficker. Unlike Mafia, who had been in America for decades, Maranzano imported dozens of young Sicilian criminals directly from Castellammare. These men were absolutely loyal to him and had no ties to the existing New York underworld. Tension between Mafia and Maranzano was inevitable. Both men wanted to be the boss of bosses, the capo di tutti capi, by 1930. That tension exploded into open warfare. The Castellammarese War, named after Maranzano's hometown, would last from 1930 to 1931 and claim dozens of lives. It would reshape the New York underworld forever. The war began over territorial disputes and grew into a life-or-death struggle for control of the Italian underworld in New York. Mafia, with his larger army of soldiers, seemed to have the advantage. But Maranzano was a brilliant strategist, and he had something Mafia lacked: the support of the Young Turks. Luciano, Genovese, Coslo, and others secretly hated Mafia. They saw him as a greedy, short-sighted tyrant who was bad for business. The constant warfare was attracting too much police attention and interfering with profitable bootlegging operations. They wanted the war to end, but more importantly, they wanted both old world bosses gone. Bodies began appearing in the streets of Brooklyn and Manhattan. Gangsters were gunned down in broad daylight. Cars filled with bullet holes became common sights in Italian neighborhoods. The newspapers sensationalized every killing, and the public demanded action. The police, many of whom were on various gangsters' payrolls, had to make token efforts at enforcement. Through it all, Maranzano maintained his headquarters in a seemingly legitimate real estate office on Park Avenue. He kept detailed organizational charts of both armies, updating them as men were killed or switched sides. He studied the tactics of Julius Caesar and tried to apply ancient military strategy to modern gang warfare. By early 1931, the war had reached a stalemate. Mafia and Maranzano were both losing money, losing men, and losing the patience of their own soldiers. Something had to break. Lucky Luciano decided to break it himself. On April 15, 1931, Joe Mafia drove to Coney Island for lunch at Nuova Villa Tamaro, a popular seafood restaurant owned by Gerardo Scarpato on West 15th Street. His companion was Lucky Luciano, his trusted lieutenant. The two men enjoyed a leisurely meal: clams, lobster, pasta. They drank wine and played cards. After several hours, Luciano excused himself to use the restroom. Within moments, 4 men, later identified as Albert Anastasia, Vito Genovese, Joe Adonis, and Bugsy Siegel, entered the restaurant. They walked directly to Messeria's table and opened fire. 20 bullets struck Joe the boss. He died instantly, slumping over the table, the cards still in his hand, according to legend. An ace of spades was found in his hand, though this detail is widely considered newspaper exaggeration or staged. As he was actually playing pinochle, Luciano emerged from the restroom claiming he had heard nothing. The police questioned him extensively, but could prove nothing. Everyone in the restaurant suddenly developed amnesia. The Code of Omerta held strong. Messeria's death ended the Castellamarese War. But Luciano had not acted alone. He had secretly met with Maranzano before the hit, promising to eliminate Messeria in exchange for peace and a position of power in whatever structure Maranzano established. Maranzano agreed, and suddenly he stood alone as the most powerful Italian gangster in New York. Shortly after Messeria's death, Salvatore Maranzano called a large meeting of crime bosses, often described as hundreds of gangsters at a location in upstate New York. Accounts vary, but it's commonly cited as Wappingers Falls. He presented it under legitimate business cover, such as a banquet or convention. Armed guards checked everyone at the door. No weapons were allowed inside except those carried by Maranzano's personal bodyguards. What happened at that meeting would structure organized crime in New York for the next 9 decades. Maranzano stood before the assembled gangsters and delivered a lecture on organization, drawing on his classical education. He explained that the Roman legions had conquered the world through discipline and structure. Italian organized crime would do the same. The days of chaotic gang warfare were over. He announced the creation of 5 separate crime families in New York. Each would have its own territory and leadership, but all would answer to a central authority, himself as Capo di Tutti Capi. The 5 families would be the Luciano family, later Genovese, led by Lucky Luciano; the Mangano family, later Gambino, led by Vincent Mangano; the Profaci family, later Colombo, led by Joe Profaci; the Gagliano family, later Lucchese, led by Tommy Gagliano; the Maranzano family, led by Salvatore Maranzano himself, which would later pass to Joe Bonanno, becoming the Bonanno family. Each family would follow a strict hierarchy: the boss, Capo, at the top, making all major decisions. Below him, an underboss, sotto capo, who handled day-to-day operations, a consigliere or counselor, who advised the boss but had no direct authority. Below them, several captains, caporegime or capatacina, each controlling a crew of soldiers. At the bottom, the soldiers, soldati, who were made members of the family, and below them, the associates, criminals who worked with the family but weren't formally inducted. The rules were strict. Only men of Italian descent could be made members. Killing another made member without permission from leadership was punishable by death. All soldiers had to give a portion of their earnings up to their captain, who kicked up to the boss. Absolute loyalty was demanded. Omerta was sacred. Maranzano's vision was thorough and brilliant. For the first time, organized crime would actually be organized. But he made one fatal mistake. He still wanted to be the boss of all bosses, the supreme ruler. And Lucky Luciano, along with other young Turks, had not fought a war just to replace one tyrant with another. Lucky Luciano was not a man to be ruled. After Maranzano's grand organizational meeting, Luciano maintained an appearance of loyalty while secretly plotting his own takeover. He confided in his closest associates, Meyer Lansky, Frank Koslow, Vito Genovese, that Maranzano had to go. The young Turk's objection to Maranzano wasn't personal. it was philosophical. They believed the capo di tutti capi concept was outdated and dangerous. Absolute power invited absolute corruption. It made one man the target for ambitious underlings. It concentrated too much attention in one place. Better, they thought, to have a council of equals where disputes could be settled by vote rather than violence, through wiretaps and informants. Luciano learned that Maranzano was planning to kill him and several other young Turks. The old boss had grown paranoid, seeing threats everywhere. He had scheduled a meeting at his Park Avenue office for September 10, 1931. And Luciano was convinced it was a trap, so Luciano struck first. On September 10, 1931, at approximately 2:00 p.m., 4 men walked into Maranzano's 9th floor office at 230 Park Avenue. They were dressed as police officers and flashed badges, Maranzano's bodyguards. Thinking this was a legitimate raid, didn't resist. The fake cops ordered everyone against the wall. 2 of the men entered Maranzano's private office. What happened next was brutal and swift. Maranzano was stabbed 6 times and shot 4 times. The killers were believed to be Jewish gangsters hired by Meyer Lansky, though their exact identities were never confirmed. Using Jewish killers was strategic. If any witnesses survived, they wouldn't be able to identify members of Italian families. The men walked out calmly, took the elevator down, and disappeared into Manhattan's lunchtime crowds with Maranzano's death. The Castellamarese War truly ended. More importantly, the era of the capo di tutti capi ended. Lucky Luciano had a different vision, one that would prove far more durable and far more dangerous to law enforcement. He called it the Commission. In the aftermath of Maranzano's murder, Lucky Luciano moved quickly to consolidate power, but in a revolutionary way. Instead of declaring himself the new boss of bosses, he proposed something unprecedented: a governing body where the bosses of the major families would meet as equals to resolve disputes, plan strategy, and maintain order. The Commission, as it came to be known, was modeled partly on corporate boards of directors. It initially consisted of 7 members, the bosses of the 5 New York families, plus representatives from Chicago, initially Frank Nitti or Paul Ricca, as Al Capone was imprisoned, and Stefano Magaddino, representing Buffalo later. The Commission would expand to include other cities. The Commission's rules were clear. Major decisions affecting organized crime as a whole required a vote. No family could move against another without Commission approval. Disputes between families would be decided by the full Commission. Most importantly, the boss of bosses concept was permanently abolished. All Commission members were equals. It was, in its way, a criminal democracy, or perhaps an oligarchy. The Commission's first headquarters was a series of rotating meeting places, restaurants, social clubs, hotel suites. Meetings were infrequent, but important. The structure provided stability while maintaining flexibility. It reduced violence by providing a forum for resolving disputes peacefully. And it made law enforcement's job infinitely harder. There was no longer one target, one kingpin to arrest. The organization had become truly decentralized. The 5 New York families that Maranzano had created remained, but their character would evolve under the Commission system. Lucky Luciano took control of what had been Joe Maseria's old family, the larger and more powerful of the 2 warring factions. This became the Luciano family, though it would later be renamed after Vito Genovese. From the beginning, it was the most powerful of the 5 families. Luciano's territory included prime Manhattan real estate, the garment district, where the family controlled unions and collected payments from clothing manufacturers. The docks, where longshoremen's unions provided opportunities for cargo theft and extortion. And downtown Manhattan, where political connections were made and maintained. Frank Costello served as Luciano's underboss. Costello's strength lay in his political connections. He built relationships with Tammany Hall politicians, judges and police commissioners, his approach was subtle: expensive gifts, discreet cash payments, favors that could be called in later. He understood that in America, unlike Sicily, the law was not the enemy. The law was a business partner that required proper compensation. Vito Genovese, on the other hand, was Luciano's enforcer, where Cuslo used charm. Genovese used fear. He was paranoid, violent, and ruthless. But he was also cunning and patient, willing to wait years for revenge against anyone he believed had disrespected him. Vincent Mangano had served under Masseria during the Castellamarese War and survived by staying relatively neutral. He was cautious and diplomatic, preferring negotiation to violence. His family controlled Brooklyn's waterfront and the profitable rackets that came with it: gambling, loan sharking, and labor union corruption. Mangano's underboss was his brother, Philip, and his most dangerous soldier was Albert Anastasia. Born Umberto Anastasio in Calabria in 1902, Anastasia had come to America as a teenage sailor who jumped ship in New York Harbor. He was a brutal killer who headed a group that the press would later sensationally call Murder, Inc. Murder, Inc. was not a company, but rather a loose association of killers, both Italian and Jewish, who carried out contract murders for the various crime families. Anastasia and his partner, Louis Lepke, ran this operation with businesslike efficiency. Killers were selected based on skill and availability. Murders were committed far from the victim's home territory to hide the motive. Bodies were sometimes hidden, sometimes displayed as warnings. Between the early 1930s and early 1940s, Murder, Inc. was believed responsible for between 400 and 1,000 murders. Joe Profaci was perhaps the wealthiest and most conservative of the original bosses. Born in Sicily in 1897, he came to America in 1921 and built a fortune importing olive oil, though he also used his import business to smuggle narcotics and other contraband. Profaci ran his family like a medieval lord, demanding tribute from vassals. He required each member to pay him a monthly fee, and he took a larger percentage of his soldiers' earnings than other bosses. This created resentment that would later erupt into violence. Despite his greed, Profaci was devoutly religious. He attended Mass regularly, donated large sums to Catholic charities, and maintained a respectable public image. He believed this provided protection against law enforcement and divine judgment alike. Tommy Gagliano was the least known of the original 5 bosses, which was precisely how he liked it. He operated in the shadows, avoiding publicity and unnecessary violence. His family controlled the Bronx and parts of Harlem, running gambling operations, hijacking trucks, and controlling unions in the garment district. Gagliano's underboss was Tommy Lucchese, a sophisticated and intelligent gangster who would eventually give the family his name. Lucchese understood that the most profitable crimes were those the public barely noticed: labor racketeering, bid rigging in construction, skimming from legitimate businesses. Violence was expensive and attracted attention. Better to make money quietly. Joe Bonanno was Maranzano's protege and the youngest of the original 5 bosses at 31. Born in Sicily in 1905, he had come with Maranzano as part of the Castellamarese faction. He was intelligent, ambitious, and deeply traditional. Bonanno's family controlled Brooklyn neighborhoods like Williamsburg and parts of Queens, as well as operations in upstate New York and Canada. They were involved in all the standard rackets: gambling, loan sharking, extortion, but also in more exotic enterprises like counterfeit currency and smuggling. What set Bonanno apart was his vision of himself as a man of honor leading a centuries-old tradition. He saw the Mafia not as a criminal organization, but as a Sicilian cultural institution transplanted to America. This romantic view would eventually lead him into conflict with more practical bosses. The commission established more than just structure. It put into writing the rules that had governed Sicilian, organized crime for generations and adapted them to American conditions. The initiation ceremony was sacred. A potential member, a button or made guy, had to be sponsored by an existing member and approved by the family boss. The ceremony usually took place in a private room with the family's leadership present. The inductee would hold a burning piece of paper, often featuring an image of a saint, and swear an oath of loyalty in Sicilian dialect or Italian. "May I burn like this saint if I betray the family." A drop of the inductee's blood would be drawn, usually from a pricked finger, symbolizing his willingness to spill blood for the family and his understanding that his blood could be spilled if he betrayed it. Once made, a member enjoyed certain privileges. He could not be killed without the boss's permission. He could demand a percentage of any criminal earnings generated in his territory. He could call on other members for assistance, and he was protected by the full weight of the family's organization. But the obligations were severe. A made member could be called upon to commit murder. He had to give up a portion of all his earnings to his captain. He could not cooperate with law enforcement under any circumstances. Omerta was absolute, and he could never leave the life except through death. The commission also established rules about what crimes were acceptable. Murder for business purposes was permitted if authorized. Killing civilians or attracting too much law enforcement attention was forbidden. Dealing in narcotics was supposedly prohibited. This rule was widely violated because drug trafficking brought severe federal sentences that might make members cooperate with prosecutors. Respect and protocol governed everything. A soldier could not approach a boss directly, but had to go through his captain. Disputes between members had to be settled by the leadership, not through personal violence. Disrespecting a made member was a serious offense that could result in death. This system, for all its brutality, worked remarkably well. It provided stability, reduced chaotic violence, and allowed the families to grow enormously wealthy throughout the 1930s and 1940s. Lucky Luciano's time at the top of his family was surprisingly short. In 1936, New York County District Attorney Thomas E. Dewey launched an aggressive campaign against organized crime. Dewey, ambitious and publicity-savvy, saw prosecution of major mob figures as a path to higher office. Unable to prove Luciano's involvement in murders or racketeering, Dewey went after him for compulsory prostitution, forcing women into sex work. The case was controversial. Some historians believe the witnesses against Luciano were forced or made up their testimony. But the jury convicted, and Luciano was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. Luciano ran his family from behind bars for several years, communicating through visitors and smuggled messages. But his direct control was gone. Frank Coslow effectively took over as acting boss, while Vito Genovese schemed and waited for his own opportunity. Then came World War II, and one of the strangest episodes in American military history. In early 1942, the SS Normandy, a massive French luxury liner being converted into an Allied troop transport, caught fire and capsized at a Manhattan pier. The Navy suspected sabotage, though the cause was probably accidental. Nevertheless, military intelligence worried about Axis saboteurs operating on the New York waterfront. Someone proposed an unusual solution: enlist the Mafia's help. The Italian gangsters controlled the longshoremen's unions and the docks. Nothing happened on the waterfront without their knowledge. If they could be convinced to cooperate, sabotage could be prevented. This led to what would be called Operation Underworld. Naval intelligence officers met with Meyer Lansky, who arranged for them to visit Lucky Luciano in prison. Luciano agreed to help in exchange for better prison conditions and the possibility of parole after the war. Exactly what Luciano did remains classified and disputed. Apparently, he spread the word among mobsters who controlled the docks: protect the ships, watch for saboteurs, report suspicious activity. Whether this had any real effect is unknown. No further major incidents of sabotage occurred, but none had occurred before the operation either. Nevertheless, after the war, Luciano's cooperation was rewarded. In 1946, Governor Thomas E. Dewey, the same prosecutor who had convicted him, reduced his sentence on condition that Luciano be deported to Italy and never return to the United States. Lucky Luciano, the man who had built the modern American Mafia, boarded a ship for Italy in February 1946. He would never see America again, though he would continue to influence organized crime from exile for the rest of his life. Before settling permanently in Italy, Luciano made one last attempt to establish himself close to American operations. In late 1946, he traveled to Cuba and set up residence in Havana. Just 90 miles from Florida, in December 1946, Luciano hosted what became known as the Havana Conference, a summit of American organized crime figures at the Hotel Nacional. Virtually every major mob leader in America attended: Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, Joe Bonanno, Santo Trafficante Jr. from Tampa, Carlos Marcello from New Orleans, and Meyer Lansky. The gathering was supposedly a celebration and vacation, but serious business was conducted. The assembled bosses discussed the future of organized crime, territorial divisions, and new opportunities in Cuba, where dictator Fulgencio Batista was friendly to American gambling interests. One attendee, however, caused problems: Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, the handsome, violent gangster who had worked with Luciano for years, was building a luxury casino in Las Vegas called the Flamengo. The project was wildly over budget and losing money. Worse, some suspected Siegel was stealing construction funds. The Havana Conference reportedly decided Siegel's fate. He was given time to prove the Flamengo could be profitable when it failed to do so quickly enough. Siegel was shot to death in his girlfriend's Beverly Hills home on June 20, 1947. The murder was never solved, but everyone knew it was a commission decision. The conference was broken up when the U.S. government learned of Luciano's presence in Cuba and pressured the Cuban government to deport him. In early 1947, Luciano was sent back to Italy, this time for good. He would live in Naples and Rome, visited regularly by American mobsters seeking his counsel. But his day-to-day control of American organized crime was finished. Frank Costello was now the boss of the Luciano family, in fact as well as name. If Lucky Luciano was the architect of the modern mafia, Frank Costello was its statesman. Throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s, Costello was arguably the most powerful organized crime figure in America, and certainly the most sophisticated. Costello's power came not from violence, but from connections. He had relationships at every level of New York's political and legal establishment. He knew judges, congressmen, district attorneys, and police commissioners. He attended charity galas, donated to political campaigns, and maintained an appearance of legitimacy. His home was a luxury apartment on Central Park West. He was driven in expensive cars, ate at the finest restaurants, and dressed in hand-tailored suits. He avoided being photographed and gave no interviews, but he was known to everyone who mattered in New York's power structure. Under Costello's leadership, the family expanded its gambling operations significantly. They controlled most of the slot machines in New York City, plus major bookmaking and numbers operations. They had interests in legitimate businesses, liquor distributorships, hotels, nightclubs. Costello believed in minimizing violence and maximizing profit through political corruption and business skill. But Vito Genovese was growing impatient. He had fled to Italy in 1937 to avoid murder charges, but returned to the United States after the war, expecting to resume his position as a top figure in the family. Instead, he found Costello firmly in control. The two men had radically different approaches. Where Costello was diplomatic and restrained, Genovese was violent and paranoid. Where Costello sought accommodation with law enforcement, Genovese trusted only fear and omerta. The conflict between them would eventually tear the family apart and lead to one of the most sensational incidents in Mafia history. While Costello and Genovese maneuvered, another family was in turmoil. In 1951, Vincent Mangano disappeared. His brother Philip was found shot to death in a marsh in Brooklyn. The murders were never solved, but everyone knew who was responsible: Albert Anastasia, the family's underboss. Anastasia had grown tired of serving under the cautious Mangano brothers. With their removal, he simply declared himself the new boss. This was unprecedented. An underboss murdering his boss and taking over, but the commission, perhaps fearing Anastasia's reputation for violence, chose not to retaliate. Under Anastasia's leadership, the family became more aggressive and violent. Anastasia was not a subtle man. He believed in intimidation and murder as business tools. His involvement with Murder, Inc. had given him a taste for killing that never left him. He was also paradoxically loyal to his friends. He maintained close relationships with Frank Costello and with Meyer Lansky, the Jewish gangster who served as organized crime's financial genius. This loyalty would prove to be both his strength and his weakness. By the mid-1950s, the American Mafia was at its peak of power and wealth. The families controlled unions, politicians, entire industries. They took in millions of dollars from gambling, loan sharking, extortion, and increasingly, despite the official prohibition, narcotics trafficking. But success brought attention. Congressional investigations were beginning. The FBI, for years insisting that organized crime was not a federal problem, was starting to pay attention, and within the families, ambitious men were plotting before going forward. Remember, if you're enjoying the video, smash the like button and drop a comment. On November 14th, 1957, dozens of the most powerful organized crime figures in America gathered at a private estate in Appalachian, a small town in upstate New York. The estate belonged to Joseph Joe the Barber Barbara, a low-profile mobster who occasionally hosted gatherings. This meeting was different. It was a gathering of the commission and family representatives from across the country. At least 60 men, possibly more. They came to discuss serious business: the narcotics trade, Cuban gambling operations, and internal family disputes. But someone tipped off the New York State Police. Sergeant Edgar Croswell, who had been investigating Barbara for years, noticed the unusual number of expensive cars with out-of-state plates arriving at the estate. He organized a roadblock when police approached the house. Panic followed. Made men, vicious killers who had faced down rival gangsters without flinching, fled through the woods in their expensive suits and handmade shoes. Police rounded up dozens of them. Many gave false names. Some claimed to be traveling salesmen who had all coincidentally stopped to visit their sick friend, Joe Barbara. The arrests were a public relations disaster for organized crime and a propaganda victory for law enforcement. For decades, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had denied that organized crime existed as a national phenomenon. Appalachian proved him wrong. The men arrested came from crime families across the country: New York, Chicago, Buffalo, Philadelphia, Los Angeles. Clearly, it was a national organization. The names captured at Appalachian read like a who's who of organized crime: Vito Genovese, Joe Bonanno, Carlo Gambino, Joe Profaci Santo Trafficante, and dozens of others. Conspicuously absent were Frank Costello, who was recovering from an assassination attempt, and Meyer Lansky, who had been warned to stay away. The Appalachian disaster changed everything. Law enforcement could no longer ignore organized crime's existence. The FBI began treating the Mafia as a priority. Congressional hearings intensified, and within the families, questions arose about who had betrayed them. The informant was never publicly identified, though theories abounded. But before Appalachian, Another dramatic event had shaken the New York underworld. On the morning of October 25, 1957, Albert Anastasia sat in the barber chair at the Park Sheraton Hotel in Manhattan. He was getting a shave and haircut, protected by his bodyguard, who waited in the lobby. Anastasia was relaxed, his face covered in hot towels, his eyes closed. Two men, their faces partially hidden by scarves, entered the barber shop. They walked directly to Anastasia's chair. One of them said something. Anastasia, recognizing the voice or sensing danger, opened his eyes and saw the men reflected in the mirror. He tried to stand, reaching for a gun that wasn't there. The killers opened fire. The first bullet struck Anastasia in the chair. He lunged toward his attackers, whether in a desperate attempt to fight or simply from the impact of the bullets. No one knows. They fired multiple times. Anastasia fell to the floor, dying in a pool of blood on the barbershop's tile. The killers walked out calmly and disappeared into Manhattan's crowds. They were never identified, never caught, but the underworld knew who had ordered the hit: Vito Genovese, with the approval or at least the acceptance of other commission members. Anastasia had become a problem. He was too violent, too unpredictable. He had been involved in unauthorized killings. He had made enemies, and he was loyal to Frank Costello, Genovese's rival. His death served multiple purposes. It removed a dangerous loose cannon, it weakened Costello, and it sent a message about commission discipline. With Anastasia dead, control of his family passed to his underboss, Carlo Gambino, a quiet, calculating Sicilian who would prove to be one of the most successful mob bosses in American history. And with Anastasia's death, the final obstacle to Vito Genovese's ambition was removed: Costello. His influence shaken by the earlier assassination attempt against him, and now by his allies' murder, stepped aside. Genovese became the official boss of what was now called the Genovese family. But Genovese's triumph was short-lived. Within 2 years, he would be in federal prison, the victim of a scheme more devious than any he had ever imagined, while Vito Genovese basked in his victory. A more patient and cunning boss was consolidating power. Carlo Gambino had been born in Palermo, Sicily in 1902, and came to America illegally as a stowaway in 1921. He was short, thin, and unremarkable in appearance. Exactly the kind of man who could disappear in a crowd, which was precisely his strategy. Gambino had worked his way up through the Bonanno family as a loyal soldier and captain. He had survived the violence between Bonanno and Anastasia by keeping his head down and saying little. When Anastasia became boss, Gambino served as his underboss without complaint. But he was building alliances, making connections, and waiting for his opportunity. That opportunity came when Anastasia was murdered. Whether Gambino actively participated in the plot or simply benefited from it remains unclear. What is certain is that he became boss of what would now be called the Gambino family, and under his leadership it would become the most powerful crime family in America. Gambino's strength was his intelligence and patience. He avoided the spotlight entirely. While bosses like John Gotti would later crave media attention, Gambino gave no interviews, avoided being photographed, and lived modestly. At least by Mafia standards, his home was a simple 2-story house in Brooklyn. He dressed conservatively and maintained a low profile. But behind this modest appearance was a criminal empire. Gambino controlled much of Brooklyn and Staten Island. His family dominated the waterfront, the garment district, and the trucking industry. They ran gambling operations throughout the city and had expanded into legitimate businesses: construction, waste management, food distribution. Gambino was also the commission's most skilled diplomat. He mediated disputes between families, built consensus, and maintained the peace that allowed everyone to make money. Other bosses might have been more violent or more charismatic, but none were as effective at the actual business of organized crime as Carlo Gambino. Vito Genovese's reign as boss lasted barely 2 years. In 1959, he was arrested on narcotics conspiracy charges and convicted, primarily on the testimony of a low-level drug dealer named Nelson Cantalopes. Genovese was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. What Genovese didn't know, and wouldn't learn until much later, was that the entire prosecution had been arranged by his rivals. Meyer Lansky, the brilliant Jewish gangster who had worked with Luciano for decades, had allegedly set up the frame with the help of federal narcotics agents. The dealer who testified against Genovese had been paid and coached. The evidence had been manufactured. Why go to such elaborate lengths? Because Genovese had become a problem for everyone. His ambition had led to Costello's removal and Anastasia's murder. Creating instability, his greed threatened everyone's profits, and his violent nature risked bringing too much law enforcement attention to organized crime. So his rivals used the law to eliminate him, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of how to manipulate the American criminal justice system. Genovese would die in prison in 1969, still claiming he had been framed, still plotting his return to power. Control of his family fell to a series of acting bosses and front bosses. While the real power was exercised by committee, this decentralized structure, while confusing to law enforcement, proved remarkably effective. The Genovese family remained powerful throughout the 1960s and 1970s, even without a clear boss. While Gambino consolidated power and Genovese went to prison, another family was tearing itself apart. Joe Profaci had ruled his family since 1931, but his greed had created enemies within his own organization. In 1960, a group of younger members led by the Gallo brothers, Larry, Albert Crazy Joey, and Ralph, rebelled against Profaci's high taxes and harsh rule. The Gallos were ambitious and violent, particularly Joey, whose erratic behavior earned him his nickname. The Gallo revolt began with the kidnapping of several Profaci family leaders, including the boss's underboss and his brother-in-law. The Gallos demanded a greater share of the family's earnings and more respect. Profaci negotiated, made promises, and then when the hostages were released, immediately went back on his word and declared war. The First Colombo War, as it became known, lasted from 1960 to 1963 and resulted in a dozen deaths. The Gallos held out in their stronghold in South Brooklyn, but they were outnumbered. Profaci died of natural causes in 1962, and his successor Joe Magliocco continued the war until his own death from a heart attack in 1963. The commission finally stepped in to end the conflict. They installed Joseph Colombo as the new boss and forced a truce. Colombo was supposed to be a compromise candidate who could unite the warring factions. Instead, his tenure would prove just as controversial as his predecessors. Joe Colombo was not your typical mob boss, born in Brooklyn in 1923. He had worked his way up through the Profaci family as a reliable soldier, but he lacked the respect and seriousness that traditionally marked mafia leadership. He was vain, publicity-seeking, and prone to making impulsive decisions. In 1970, Colombo did something unprecedented. He founded the Italian-American Civil Rights League and began publicly protesting what he claimed was discrimination against Italian Americans. He organized rallies, gave speeches, and courted media attention. His argument was that the FBI and media unfairly stereotyped Italian Americans as criminals. The very term mafia, he claimed, was a slur. When the FBI arrested his son for melting down coins to sell the silver, Colombo organized protests at FBI headquarters. The Italian-American Civil Rights League grew rapidly, with tens of thousands of members and several high-profile celebrity supporters. The first Italian Unity Day rally in Columbus Circle drew 50,000 people. It was, on its face, a legitimate civil rights organization, but it was also a brilliant public relations move for organized crime. Other commission members were horrified. The whole point of the Mafia's structure was to remain invisible. Colombo was deliberately attracting attention. Worse, he was using the organization to pursue personal matters, like the charges against his son, rather than family business. On June 28, 1971, at the Second Italian Unity Day rally, Joseph Colombo stood on stage in Columbus Circle preparing to address the crowd. A black man named Jerome Johnson approached him, supposedly to take a photograph instead. Johnson pulled out a gun and shot Colombo 3 times in the head and neck. Colombo collapsed in the chaos. Johnson was immediately shot dead by unknown gunmen, almost certainly Colombo family members providing security. Johnson's murder ensured he could never explain who had sent him. Colombo survived but was left paralyzed and brain damaged. He would live in this condition for 7 more years before dying in 1978. The shooting was never officially solved, but the underworld knew it was a commission decision. Colombo had violated the fundamental rule. He had drawn too much attention. Control of the family passed to Underboss Carmen Jr. Persico, a more traditional boss who would rule the family for decades, much of that time from prison. While Gambino became the most powerful boss and Colombo the most visible, Tommy Lucchese represented a different approach, becoming virtually invisible. Lucchese had taken control of his family from Tommy Gagliano in 1951, and under his leadership, it became perhaps the most sophisticated criminal organization in New York. Lucchese understood that the most profitable crimes were those nobody noticed. His family controlled unions in the garment district, airport cargo, construction, and waste management. They didn't rob stores or shake down shopkeepers. Instead, they rigged bids on construction contracts, stole from union pension funds, and received payments from legitimate businesses seeking labor peace. Lucchese himself lived modestly in Lido Beach, Long Island. He maintained a small circle of trusted associates and rarely appeared in public. Law enforcement knew his name, but they struggled to build cases against him. His crimes were complex, white-collar schemes that left minimal evidence. When Lucchese died of natural causes in 1967, he had never spent a day in prison despite a lifetime in organized crime. It was a remarkable achievement and a model that his successors tried to follow. His replacement, Carmine Trementi, was quickly imprisoned, and the real power fell to Anthony Tony Dux Corallo, who earned his nickname from his skill at ducking criminal charges under Corallo. The family continued Lucchese's approach: sophisticated white-collar crime, minimal violence, maximum profit. Joseph Bonanno was perhaps the most complicated of the commission bosses. He was intelligent, cultured, and deeply traditional. He saw himself as a man of honor, leading an ancient institution. He also possessed enormous ambition and a dangerous tendency to ignore commission decisions when they conflicted with his interests. Throughout the 1950s and early 1960s, the Bonanno family expanded beyond New York into Canada, California, Arizona, and even Haiti. Bonanno built alliances with other families, always with an eye toward expanding his power and influence. But in 1964, the commission learned that Bonanno was plotting to kill several commission members, including Carlo Gambino and Tommy Lucchese. The plot, which became known as the Banana Split, was an ambitious attempt to eliminate his rivals and make himself the dominant boss. The commission summoned Bonanno to explain himself. He refused to appear. In October 1964, Bonanno disappeared off the streets of Manhattan, allegedly kidnapped. He would later claim he had been held for 6 weeks by rivals within the commission. Other sources suggest he went into hiding voluntarily. Regardless, the commission had had enough. They installed a new boss, Gaspar Di Gregorio, and sparked a civil war within the Bonanno family that lasted from 1964 to 1968. The conflict was sometimes called the Banana War. Playing on Bonanno's name, the war was costly and pointless. Bonanno finally retired to Arizona in 1968. Claiming health problems, his family was left weakened and divided, never to regain its former power. In his later years, Bonanno would write an autobiography, A Man of Honor, that infuriated other mobsters by violating omerta and discussing the mafia's internal workings. He died in 2002 at age 97, one of the last surviving original commission bosses. By the late 1960s and throughout the 1970s, the five families controlled a staggering criminal empire worth billions of dollars annually. While estimates varied and precise figures were impossible, investigators believed organized crime's annual revenues exceeded those of many Fortune 500 companies. Gambling remained a foundation. The families controlled illegal bookmaking throughout New York, taking bets on sports, horse racing, and numbers games. Illegal gambling generated steady income with minimal risk. Most customers were happy repeat clients, and law enforcement considered it a low priority compared to violent crime. Loan sharking was equally profitable. Mobsters loaned money at very high interest rates to people who couldn't get traditional bank loans, often because they were themselves criminals or gambling addicts. Not paying meant violence, but most paid. The mafia's reputation ensured collection rates that banks could only envy. Labor racketeering was perhaps the most sophisticated racket. By controlling unions, the families could demand payoffs from employers seeking labor peace, steal from union pension funds, and give no-show jobs to family members. The Teamsters, the Longshoremen's Union, construction trade unions all had mafia influence at various levels. Construction and concrete were particularly lucrative in New York's building boom. The families formed a cartel that controlled concrete supply to major projects. Every major building in New York during the 1970s and 1980s paid a tax to the mafia, usually 2% of the concrete cost. Waste management, or garbage as mobsters called it, was another controlled industry. The families divided up collection routes throughout the region. Legitimate waste management companies that wanted to operate in New York had to pay tribute or face intimidation. The waterfront had been mafia territory since the 1930s. Cargo theft, union control, and protection rackets generated enormous profits. The movie On the Waterfront had shown this world in the 1950s. But the reality persisted for decades longer. Narcotics trafficking, officially forbidden by the Commission, was in reality a major money maker for many members. Heroin importation, particularly the famous French connection through Marseille and Montreal into New York, generated massive profits. The official prohibition meant that members caught dealing drugs often weren't protected by the family. But the money was too good to resist. The families also invested in legitimate businesses, restaurants, nightclubs, construction companies, waste management firms, and real estate. These provided both legal income and money laundering opportunities. Some businesses were completely legitimate. Others were fronts. Most were somewhere in between. In 1972, a movie changed how America saw organized crime, The Godfather. Directed by Francis Ford Coppola and based on Mario Puzo's novel, presented the mafia as tragic, honorable, and almost sympathetic. Marlon Brando's portrayal of Don Vito Corleone became iconic. The film's famous quote, "I'm going to make him an offer he can't refuse," entered the cultural language. Real mobsters loved The Godfather. It portrayed them as men of honor and tradition rather than common criminals. The film's vision of the mafia as a family business where loyalty and respect mattered more than money appealed to their self-image. Some mobsters claimed they watched it repeatedly. They copied its mannerisms and quoted its dialogue. In a strange case of life imitating art imitating life, the movie influenced how younger mobsters behaved and thought about themselves. The Godfather Part 2, released in 1975, was even more ambitious, tracing the origins of organized crime while showing its modern corruption. Together, The films created a mythological version of the Mafia that was far more romantic than the reality of drug dealing, murder, and extortion, but the films also brought attention. They made the Mafia a subject of fascination rather than fear. And they came at the same time as increased law enforcement efforts that would eventually bring the golden age to an end. On December 11, 1978, a crew of criminals associated with the Lucchese family pulled off the most lucrative cash robbery in American history. They stole approximately $5 million in cash and nearly $1 million in jewels from the Lufthansa cargo terminal at Kennedy Airport. Around $20 million in today's dollars. The heist was masterminded by James "Jimmy" the Gent Burke, a Lucchese associate, and was immortalized in the movie Goodfellas. Though the film downplayed the amount stolen, the robbery was brilliant in its planning and execution. The thieves knew exactly when the cash shipment would arrive, how the security systems worked, and how to bypass them. But the aftermath was a bloodbath. Burke, paranoid about loose ends and unwilling to share the profits, began systematically murdering everyone involved in the robbery. One by one, the crew members disappeared or turned up dead. Within a year, at least 8 people connected to the heist had been killed. The murders drew more law enforcement attention than the robbery itself. FBI agent Edward McDonald made the case a priority. Eventually, Burke was convicted of murder, though never for the Lufthansa heist itself, and died in prison. The case helped bring down Lucchese family captain Paul Vario and contributed to the eventual cooperation of Henry Hill, a Lucchese associate whose testimony would damage the family significantly. The Lufthansa heist represented both the brilliance and the self-destructive nature of organized crime. The robbery itself was nearly perfect, but the greed, paranoia, and violence that followed turned victory into disaster. On May 5, 1981, 3 Bonanno family captains, Alphonse Sonny Red Indelicato, Philip Lucky Giacconi, and Dominic Big Trinchera, were summoned to a meeting at a social club in Brooklyn. They never left. The 3 captains were murdered by a faction within the family led by Dominic Sonny Black Napolitano and Joseph Messino. The killings were part of an internal power struggle that had been building for years. What made this murder particularly significant was the involvement of FBI agent Joseph Pistone, who had infiltrated the Bonanno family under the alias Donnie Brasco. Pistone had spent 6 years undercover, becoming close friends with Napolitano and gaining access to the family's inner workings. He had been present in the days leading up to the murders, though not at the murders themselves. When Pistone's identity was revealed in 1981, it sent shockwaves through the underworld. An FBI agent had gotten inside the sacred walls of a mafia family. He had attended family meetings, participated in crimes, and been proposed for formal membership. The breach of security was unprecedented and humiliating. The Bonanno family's response was brutal. Napolitano, who had vouched for Donnie Brasco, was himself murdered, his body found with his hands cut off, a symbol that he had brought an outsider into the family. The family offered a $500,000 contract on Pistone's life, though he entered witness protection and was never harmed. The Donnie Brasco infiltration would provide crucial evidence for future prosecutions and demonstrated that the Mafia's vaunted security was not impenetrable. More importantly, it showed that the FBI had finally made investigating the Mafia a real priority. Everything changed in 1970. Though it took a decade for anyone to fully realize it, that year, Congress passed the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO for short, initially intended to combat union corruption. RICO became the most powerful tool ever created for prosecuting organized crime. RICO allowed prosecutors to charge the leaders of criminal organizations for crimes they ordered, even if they didn't personally commit them. More importantly, it allowed for enterprise prosecution. treating an entire criminal organization as a single entity. The commission itself could be charged as a criminal enterprise. This was revolutionary. Previously, prosecutors had to prove that a boss personally committed specific crimes under RICO. They only had to prove he led a criminal organization and that the organization committed crimes. Wiretaps of the boss ordering murders or approving rackets became evidence of running a criminal enterprise, even if the boss never pulled a trigger or touched stolen money. The penalties were severe: 20 years in prison per RICO count, plus asset forfeiture. The government could seize everything purchased with criminal proceeds: homes, cars, bank accounts, businesses for the first time. Being a mob boss became genuinely risky, but RICO was only a tool. It required aggressive prosecutors willing to use it and investigators who could gather the evidence. Throughout the 1980s, both emerged. For decades, omerta had held. Made members simply did not cooperate with law enforcement. Even facing life in prison, they maintained silence. Testifying against the family was a death sentence, not just for the informant, but potentially for his entire family. But in the 1980s, the code began to crack. The first major break was Joseph Valachi in 1963, convinced that his boss, Vito Genovese, planned to kill him in prison. Valachi became the first made member to publicly testify about mafia structure and operations. His testimony before the McClellan Committee, broadcast on television, stunned the nation. For the first time, an insider confirmed the mafia's existence and explained its hierarchy. Valachi's testimony didn't lead to many prosecutions. He had been a low-level soldier with limited knowledge. But it provided a template. It showed that omerta could be broken. In the 1970s, Jimmy the Weasel Fratiano, a high-ranking West Coast mobster, became a government witness. His testimony damaged several families and demonstrated that even powerful figures would cooperate if they believed their lives were at risk. But the real flood began in the 1980s with a combination of factors: RICO's harsh sentences, the success of federal witness protection, and a generational shift in the mafia itself. Younger mobsters were less committed to the old traditions. Many had grown up in middle-class comfort rather than immigrant poverty. The mystique of omerta meant less to someone who had alternative career options. When facing 20 or 30 years in prison, cooperation started looking more attractive than honor. In 1983, Rudolph Giuliani became the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. He was ambitious, aggressive, and unafraid of publicity. He made prosecuting organized crime his top priority and brought an energy that the mafia had never faced before. Giuliani assembled a team of talented prosecutors and worked closely with the FBI, which had finally made the mafia a priority under Director William Webster. Together, they began building RICO cases against not just individual mobsters, but entire families and the commission itself. Giuliani's strategy was simple: use wiretaps and surveillance to gather evidence, then flip lower-level members to testify against their superiors. Each cooperating witness provided evidence to flip the next higher level. Build cases brick by brick until you reach the bosses. The strategy worked. The first major RICO success was the Pizza Connection case, prosecuted from 1985 to 1987. The case involved a massive heroin trafficking operation run through a network of pizza parlors across the United States. Sicilian mafia members working with the Bonanno family had imported hundreds of millions of dollars worth of heroin from Sicily. The investigation involved wiretaps in multiple languages, surveillance across several countries, and cooperation with Italian law enforcement. The trial lasted 17 months and resulted in the conviction of 18 defendants, including several Bonanno family members. The Pizza Connection proved that international drug trafficking could be successfully prosecuted under RICO. It also demonstrated the connections between the American Mafia and Sicilian organized crime, and it showed that no criminal operation was too complex for federal prosecutors to unravel. But Giuliani's masterpiece was the commission trial. In 1985, he indicted the leaders of all 5 families under RICO, charging them with operating a criminal enterprise, the commission itself. The defendants included Anthony "Fat" Tony Salerno, front boss of the Genovese family; Carmen Jr. Persico, boss of the Colombo family; Anthony "Tony" Dux Corallo, boss of the Lucchese family; Gennaro Jerry Lang Langella, acting boss of the Colombo family; Philip Rusty Rastelli, boss of the Bonanno family; Ralph Scopo, representing the Colombo family. Carlo Gambino had died in 1976, and his successor, Paul Castellano, had been murdered just before the trial began. So the Gambino family was less directly involved in this particular case. The evidence was overwhelming. The FBI had planted bugs in several key locations, including the Jaguar owned by Corallo and a house in Staten Island used for commission meetings. The bugs captured the bosses discussing murders, dividing territories, and planning criminal operations. One particularly damaging recording caught Salerno and others discussing the Concrete Club, their cartel that controlled all major concrete construction in New York. They casually discussed which families would get cuts from various projects, treating billion-dollar construction like personal property. The trial lasted 10 months. The defense strategy was to claim the prosecution was persecuting Italian Americans and that the commission didn't exist. But the evidence was too strong. In November 1986, all defendants were convicted. Salerno, Persico, and Corallo each received 100-year sentences. The others received lengthy sentences as well. At one stroke, the leadership of 3 families was gone. More importantly, the conviction proved that RICO could reach the highest levels of organized crime. Paul Castellano became boss of the Gambino family after Carlo Gambino's death in 1976. He was Gambino's brother-in-law and had been carefully groomed for the position. But he was a very different kind of boss. Castellano, called Big Paul because of his imposing size, was sophisticated and business-oriented. He lived in a mansion on Staten Island, nicknamed the White House. He wore designer suits, ate at expensive restaurants, and considered himself a legitimate businessman who happened to have organized crime interests. He focused on white-collar crime, construction bid rigging, labor racketeering, stock fraud. He distanced himself from drugs, prostitution, and street-level crime. He was making millions of dollars through construction and union control, and he saw no reason to risk that with messy drug operations. But this created resentment within the family. The captains and soldiers saw Castellano living in luxury while forbidding them from the most lucrative racket, narcotics. They felt he had lost touch with the streets and was more concerned with his mistress and his mansion than with the family's welfare. The FBI had also bugged Castellano's house and recorded him discussing criminal activities. He was indicted in the commission case and facing life in prison. His authority was crumbling. One ambitious captain saw opportunity. His name was John Gotti. John Gotti was everything Paul Castellano was not. He was flashy where Castellano was refined. He was violent where Castellano was cautious. And he was beloved by the family soldiers while Castellano was resented. Born in the Bronx in 1940 to immigrant parents, Gotti had grown up in poverty and turned to crime as a teenager. He was a skilled hijacker and participated in the notorious kidnapping and murder of James McBratney. He served time in prison, which only increased his standing with street-level mobsters. By the 1980s, Gotti was a captain in the Gambino family, running a crew out of the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club in Queens. His crew was involved in hijacking, gambling, and drug trafficking, the latter in direct violation of Castellano's orders. Gotti believed Castellano's prohibition on drugs was costing the family money. More importantly, he believed Castellano would eventually have him and other captains killed to prevent them from testifying if they were arrested on drug charges. Whether this was paranoia or reality remains debated. In late 1985, Gotti and several other captains, including Sammy the Bull Gravano, decided to kill Castellano. This was unprecedented. The commission had to approve hits on bosses. Killing your own boss without permission was a death sentence. But Gotti was gambling that the commission would accept the done deal if he moved quickly and decisively. On the evening of December 16, 1985, Paul Castellano and his underboss Thomas Bellotti drove to Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan. They were scheduled to meet with several captains for dinner. As their car pulled up to the restaurant, 4 men in identical trench coats and fur hats approached. The killers opened fire immediately. Castellano was shot 6 times in the head and body. He died on the sidewalk. Bellotti, trying to exit the car to help his boss, was shot multiple times and killed as well. The assassins walked quickly to a waiting car and disappeared into Manhattan traffic. The entire hit took less than a minute. It occurred at rush hour on a busy street, yet the killers escaped cleanly. John Gotti, in a car nearby, watched the murders to ensure they were completed successfully. Within weeks, he declared himself the new boss of the Gambino family. He waited for the commission to react, to summon him, to order his death for killing a boss without permission. The summons never came. The commission, weakened by ongoing prosecutions and not wanting another bloody war, accepted the new reality. Gotti had taken over the most powerful family in New York through sheer boldness. For the next several years, John Gotti would be the most famous mobster in America. Gotti loved attention in a way that previous bosses would have found incomprehensible. Carlo Gambino had hidden from cameras. Lucky Luciano had refused interviews. Frank Costello had protected his privacy. Gotti courted publicity. He wore $1,000 suits and held court at the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy, greeting well-wishers like a politician. He walked the streets surrounded by bodyguards. Waving to crowds, he threw elaborate 4th of July parties in his Queens neighborhood, complete with fireworks and free food. The media loved him. The tabloids called him the Dapper Don because of his expensive clothes when he was acquitted. At 3 successive trials through a combination of witness intimidation, jury tampering, and skilled defense attorneys, they renamed him the Teflon Don because no charges seemed to stick. Gotti became a celebrity. People lined up outside the Ravenite just to catch a glimpse of him. He was featured in magazine profiles and discussed on television. He represented a romanticized version of the Mafia, powerful, stylish, and living by his own rules. But his celebrity was also his undoing. The FBI made him a priority. His high profile made it impossible to ignore him, and his arrogance led him to make mistakes that more careful bosses would have avoided. The FBI had planted a bug in an apartment above the Ravenite Social Club. On those tapes, Gotti was recorded discussing murders, criminal operations, and his leadership of the Gambino family. The evidence was devastating, but prosecutors knew from experience that Gotti had beaten cases before. They needed more. They needed someone from inside the family to testify. They needed someone close to Gotti, someone who had participated in murders with him, someone the jury would believe. They needed Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano. Gravano had been Gotti's underboss and closest ally. He had helped plan the Castellano murder. He had participated in multiple killings. He was the perfect loyal soldier. But Gravano had listened to the FBI tapes, and he heard Gotti discussing potentially throwing him under the bus to save himself. Whether this was Gotti's actual intent or just loose talk, it was enough to break Gravano's loyalty. In 1991, facing life in prison, Gravano made a decision that shocked the underworld. He agreed to cooperate with the government. Sammy the Bull's defection was a catastrophe for the Mafia. He wasn't some low-level soldier. He was the underboss of the most powerful family, a made member who had committed 19 murders by his own later admission. His testimony would be unquestionable. The trial began in 1992. Gravano took the stand and over 9 days detailed the inner workings of the Gambino family. He described murders in matter-of-fact terms. He explained the structure, the rules, the rituals. He pointed at Gotti and identified him as the boss who had ordered various crimes. The jury deliberated for just 13 hours before convicting Gotti on all charges: racketeering, murder, conspiracy, obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. John Gotti was sent to the federal Supermax prison in Marion, Illinois, where he died of throat cancer in 2002. The Teflon Don had finally stuck, while Gotti sought publicity. Vincent Gigante perfected the art of invisibility, or rather the art of apparent insanity. Gigante had become boss of the Genovese family in the early 1980s. But he ran the family through a complex system of front bosses and intermediaries. He himself maintained one of the most elaborate deceptions in mafia history for nearly 3 decades. Gigante wandered the streets of Greenwich Village in a bathrobe and pajamas, mumbling to himself, apparently suffering from severe mental illness. He was nicknamed the Odd Father and the Robe when required to appear in court. He was often wheeled in on a gurney or supported by relatives, appearing completely unable to function. The act was brilliant if Gigante was mentally incompetent. He couldn't stand trial if he was genuinely insane. He couldn't be the criminal mastermind prosecutors claimed. Multiple psychiatrists examined him and gave conflicting opinions. But it was an act. Behind closed doors, Gigante was sharp, strategic, and running the most powerful family in New York. The Genovese family had learned from Gotti's mistakes. They avoided publicity, maintained discipline, and operated with a sophistication that made prosecution difficult. The FBI eventually gathered enough evidence to prove Gigante's insanity was faked. At his 1997 trial, evidence showed him conducting family business, making decisions, and displaying none of the symptoms he showed publicly. He was convicted and sentenced to 12 years. Even in prison, Gigante maintained the act for a time, but eventually facing additional charges. He admitted it had all been a deception. He died in prison in 2005. His long run as boss while pretending to be insane represented perhaps the last example of mafia cleverness. After Gigante, there would be no bosses with that combination of cunning and organizational ability. Sammy Gravano's defection opened the floodgates. If the underboss of the Gambino family could cooperate, anyone could, and many did, throughout the 1990s. Dozens of made members broke omerta. Some, like Gravano, were facing life sentences and chose cooperation over dying in prison. Others were motivated by fear. They believed their own bosses planned to kill them. Still others simply decided that the old ways were gone and cooperation was the smart play. Each cooperating witness provided evidence to convict his superiors, which created new cooperating witnesses, which led to more convictions in an ever-escalating cycle. Alfonso Darco, acting boss of the Lucchese family, became a government witness. So did Philip Lanetti, underboss of the Philadelphia family, Michael Franzese, a Colombo family captain who had made millions in a gasoline tax fraud scheme, cooperated and then later became a motivational speaker and YouTube personality. The phenomenon wasn't limited to New York. In Chicago, Los Angeles, Boston, and other cities, MAID members who had once sworn omerta were testifying against their former brothers. The Mafia's greatest strength, its code of silence, had become its greatest weakness. The assumption of loyalty could no longer be trusted. Bosses became paranoid, which led to more violence, which led to more cooperation. Not all the violence in the 1990s was driven by law enforcement. The Colombo family, always the most troubled, exploded into civil war in 1991. Carmine Persico, the boss, was in prison serving his 100-year sentence from the commission trial. His son Alphonse Persico and his designated acting boss Victor Arena began fighting over control of the family. The Third Colombo War lasted from 1991 to 1993 and resulted in, at least, 12 deaths and numerous woundings. Shootings occurred in broad daylight on Brooklyn streets. Innocent bystanders were sometimes caught in crossfire. The violence attracted massive law enforcement attention and provided prosecutors with more evidence for RICO cases. The war finally ended with both factions weakened, multiple leaders imprisoned, and the family's power significantly diminished. It demonstrated that even with the FBI dismantling organized crime, mobsters were perfectly capable of destroying themselves. By the year 2000, the five families were shadows of their former selves. At their peak in the 1970s and 1980s, the families had an estimated 3,000 made members with tens of thousands of associates. By 2000, that number had shrunk to perhaps 800 to 1,000 made members total across all five families. The bosses of the Golden Age were all dead or imprisoned. The commission rarely met, and when it did, it lacked the authority of previous decades. The younger generation of mobsters were less committed, less disciplined, and faced challenges their predecessors never imagined. But the families didn't die, they adapted. After John Gotti's imprisonment, his brother Peter briefly led the family, followed by his son John A. Junior Gotti. But Junior Gotti lacked his father's charisma and luck. He was repeatedly indicted, and though he beat some cases, he eventually pleaded guilty to racketeering and served time in prison. Leadership of the Gambino family became disputed and unclear. Various captains claimed authority. The family split into factions. Law enforcement struggled to determine who actually ran the organization. In 2008, the FBI arrested 62 members and associates of the Gambino family in a massive sweep. The charges ranged from murder to extortion to securities fraud. The family's leadership structure was in tatters. By the 2010s, the Gambino family was still active, but dramatically weakened. They maintained some traditional rackets, gambling, loan sharking, union corruption, but they were a fraction of their former power. The Genovese family, by contrast, demonstrated remarkable resilience. The family had learned from the Gotti disaster that publicity was death. They maintained a low profile, avoided sensational crimes, and operated with a discipline that other families lacked. After Gigante's imprisonment, the family was led by a series of bosses who maintained the Genovese approach: invisibility, sophistication, and a focus on lucrative white-collar crimes rather than violent street crimes. The Genovese family controlled unions in construction and waste management, operated extensive gambling and loan sharking businesses, and had evolved into cybercrime and stock fraud. They were believed to be the largest and most powerful of the five families well into the 2010s. Law enforcement continued making arrests. In 2016, 46 Genovese members and associates were charged in a massive racketeering case. But the family structure allowed it to absorb losses and continue operating. The Lucchese family followed the Genovese model of maintaining a low profile. After the imprisonment of Tony Dux Carallo and his successors, the family underwent several leadership changes, but continued its traditional focus on sophisticated white-collar crime. The family maintained its control over Kennedy Airport cargo operations, construction unions, and waste management. They evolved with the times, becoming involved in healthcare fraud, credit card fraud, and internet gambling. In the 2000s and 2010s, the Lucchese family was repeatedly targeted by law enforcement. Multiple bosses and acting bosses were arrested and convicted. But like the Genovese family, the Lucchese organization proved resilient, continuously adapting and surviving despite constant pressure. The Bonanno family had the hardest fall after the Donnie Brasco infiltration. The commission nearly expelled the entire family from La Cosa Nostra. The family was considered compromised and untrustworthy. Leadership passed to Joseph Massino, who had participated in the three captains' murder. Massino was intelligent and ruthless, and he rebuilt the family's reputation throughout the 1990s. By the early 2000s, the Bonanno family was strong again under his leadership. But Massino made a historic decision in 2004. Facing life in prison on murder charges, he agreed to cooperate with the government. The first sitting boss of a New York family to become a government witness, Massino's cooperation was a bombshell. He testified against his former associates, including acting boss Vincent Bastiano. His defection seemed to signal the final death of omerta and the traditional mafia code. The Bonanno family survived Massino's betrayal, but was left severely weakened. By the 2010s, it was considered the smallest and least powerful of the 5 families. The Colombo family never fully recovered from its 2 civil wars. Throughout the 2000s and 2010s, the family was plagued by leadership disputes, internal violence, and constant law enforcement pressure. Various factions claimed control. Carmine Persico, incredibly, still claimed to be boss from prison until his death in 2019 at age 85. After spending 3 decades behind bars, but his actual control was minimal. The family continued operating traditional rackets on a reduced scale, gambling, loan sharking, extortion, but it was a pale shadow of its former self. The family's traditional rackets evolved with the times. Gambling moved partly online, with families operating internet gambling sites. Loan sharking expanded into payday lending and other predatory financial schemes. Labor racketeering continued in construction and waste management. Though with less boldness than before, new opportunities emerged. Healthcare fraud became extremely lucrative. Mobsters created fake clinics, billed Medicare and Medicaid for services never provided, and pocketed millions. The schemes were complex enough to avoid immediate detection, but profitable enough to be worth the risk. Stock fraud and market manipulation provided white-collar opportunities. The families had always had connections to Wall Street through union pension funds and legitimate investments. Now they used those connections for pump-and-dump schemes and insider trading. Cybercrime was a new frontier, while older mobsters struggled with technology. Younger associates understood computers and the internet. They engaged in credit card fraud, identity theft, and cryptocurrency schemes. Drug trafficking remained profitable despite the official prohibition. Families trafficked in cocaine, heroin, and increasingly oxycodone and other prescription painkillers during the opioid epidemic. But these modern rackets lacked the stability of the old days. The territory was less clearly defined. Competition came from other ethnic organized crime groups: Russian, Albanian, Chinese, Mexican. And law enforcement had sophisticated tools for tracking financial crimes that made prosecution easier. The FBI and federal prosecutors never let up, even as the families weakened. Law enforcement continued targeting them with sophisticated investigations and RICO prosecutions. Wiretaps, surveillance, and electronic monitoring had become routine. The FBI could track cell phones, intercept text messages, and monitor email. The technology that helped legitimate businesses also helped law enforcement. Cooperation from former members remained common. The Witness Protection Program had proved effective at keeping witnesses alive, which encouraged others to cooperate. And the sentences for RICO convictions were so severe that cooperation often seemed like the only rational choice. Periodic sweeps arrested dozens of members at a time. In 2011, the FBI arrested 127 people connected to the Mafia in the largest single-day mob roundup in history. The charges ranged from murder to loan sharking to illegal gambling. Each arrest further weakened the family's ability to operate. The constant turnover of leadership created instability. The fear of informants created paranoia. And the reality of long prison sentences made recruitment difficult. Perhaps the family's greatest challenge was recruitment. Young Italian Americans in the 21st century had legitimate opportunities their grandparents never dreamed of. They could go to college, pursue professional careers, and achieve success legally. Why join the Mafia? The risk was enormous. Long prison sentences, constant surveillance, the possibility of being killed by rivals or your own family. The rewards were diminishing, The days of bosses making millions were largely gone. Replaced by modest earnings from gambling and loan sharking, the mystique was fading too. The younger generation had grown up watching The Sopranos and other shows that demystified the mafia. They saw it as pathetic rather than powerful, criminal rather than honorable. As a result, the family struggled to recruit quality members. Some accepted associates with criminal records or drug problems who would have been rejected in earlier eras. Standards dropped, discipline weakened, the decline became self-reinforcing. The five families also faced competition from other organized crime groups that hadn't existed or been powerful in New York during the Mafia's golden age. Russian organized crime became significant in the 1990s and 2000s, particularly in Brighton Beach, Brooklyn. Russian criminals engaged in sophisticated fraud schemes, human trafficking, and other crimes. They were often better educated than traditional mobsters and unbound by mafia traditions or rules. Albanian organized crime expanded significantly in the 2000s. Albanian criminals controlled significant portions of the drug trade, particularly heroin, and were known for extreme violence. Chinese triads and tongs had long operated in Chinatown but expanded their reach. Particularly in gambling and prostitution, Mexican cartels moved into New York's drug market, bringing their sophisticated trafficking networks and willingness to use extreme violence. Outlaw motorcycle gangs like the Hells Angels operated in New York and competed for criminal markets. These groups didn't follow mafia rules. They didn't respect territories. They were often more violent and more innovative than the traditional families. The five families, accustomed to dominating New York's underworld, found themselves just one player among many. Law enforcement's campaign against the families continued into the 2020s. In 2021, the Colombo family was hit with a major indictment, charging 14 members with racketeering, including involvement in illegal gambling, loan sharking, and money laundering. The charges revealed that despite decades of prosecutions, the family was still operating traditional rackets. In 2023, 16 people connected to the Gambino and Genovese families were arrested on various charges. The FBI stated that while the mafia was diminished, it remained alive and well. These recent cases showed a pattern. The families were still active, still making money from traditional rackets, but operating on a much smaller scale and with less sophistication than their predecessors. As of 2025, estimates suggest the five families have a combined membership of perhaps 700 to 800 made members with several thousand associates. This is down from a peak of 3,000 to 5,000 made members in the 1970s. The Genovese family remains the largest and most powerful, with perhaps 250 to 300 made members. They continue to operate with relative discipline and sophistication. The Gambino family has perhaps 200 made members and remains active despite constant leadership turnover and prosecutions. The Lucchese family has around 100 made members and maintains its traditional operations, particularly around Kennedy Airport and in construction. The Colombo family is the most fractured, with perhaps 100 members split into various factions that sometimes cooperate and sometimes conflict. The Bonanno family is the smallest, with perhaps 100 members, and is still recovering from Joseph Massino's betrayal. These are rough estimates. The secretive nature of the organizations makes exact counts impossible. But the trend is clear. The families are a fraction of their former size and power. Current leadership as of late 2025 remains intentionally unclear due to prosecutions and caution. But law enforcement and underworld sources suggest the Genovese family is led by Liborio Barney Bellomo as official boss with a focus on insulation. The Gambino family is run by Lorenzo Mannino as acting street boss. The Lucchese family operates via a ruling panel with frequent acting bosses, recently including figures like Michael DeSantis. The Colombo family is headed by Theodore Skinny Ted Persico, The Bonanno family is led by Michael Mancuso as boss. This ambiguity helps avoid RICO targets. Clear single bosses draw too much attention. The five families' impact on American culture far exceeds their actual power. They have become part of American mythology, romanticized in countless movies, television shows, and books. The Godfather trilogy established the template. The Mafia as a tragic family business where honor and loyalty matter as much as money. The films are masterpieces of American cinema, but they present a romanticized version of organized crime that hides its brutal reality. Goodfellas, 1990, provided a more realistic but still entertaining portrayal of mob life, following Henry Hill's career in the Lucchese family. The film showed the petty nature of much mob crime alongside the violence and the ultimate betrayal when Hill became a government witness. The Sopranos, 1999 to 2007, brought the Mafia into the modern era, showing mobsters dealing with therapy, family problems, and an organization in decline. The show was both realistic and deeply psychological, examining what it meant to be a criminal in contemporary America. These cultural representations have shaped how Americans think about organized crime. They've made mobsters seem more honorable and more interesting than they actually were. They've hidden the reality of violence, addiction, and destroyed lives that organized crime caused. But they've also preserved the history in public consciousness. Young people who know nothing about Lucky Luciano or Carlo Gambino have still absorbed mafia culture through movies and television. Lost in the romanticization are the real victims of organized crime, the direct victims of violence, the murdered rivals, the witnesses who wouldn't cooperate, the informants who were caught. The FBI estimates the five families were responsible for thousands of murders over their history, most never solved. The indirect victims of addiction, the heroin addicts whose habits enriched mobsters, the gambling addicts who lost everything to bookmakers, the families destroyed by drugs and debt, the economic victims, the businesses forced to pay protection money, the workers whose union pension funds were looted, the consumers who paid inflated prices because of mob control of industries, the neighborhoods scarred by violence where shootings and bombings were routine, where children grew up seeing organized crime as normal or admirable, the corruption of public institutions, police departments where officers were on mob payrolls, union locals controlled by criminals, politicians who owed their positions to organized crime support. The total cost is impossible to calculate, but it's measured in billions of dollars and countless ruined lives. The five family story is also part of the larger Italian-American immigrant experience. Though it's a story many Italian Americans understandably wish to distance themselves from. The vast majority of Italian immigrants and their descendants were law-abiding, hardworking people who contributed immensely to American society. They built businesses, fought in America's wars, and achieved success in every field. The idea that Italian Americans are somehow connected to organized crime is a prejudiced stereotype. Yet the Mafia's existence gave credence to that stereotype. Joseph Colombo's Italian-American Civil Rights League was, for all its problems, responding to a real phenomenon, the assumption that Italian heritage somehow implied criminal connections. The story of the five families is in part about how a tiny minority of criminals from one ethnic group created problems for the much larger, law-abiding majority. It's a reminder that organized crime damages not just its direct victims, but entire communities. For decades, the five families dominated organized crime in America. Several factors explain their success. Structure and discipline. The hierarchical organization provided clear chains of command and accountability. Everyone knew their place and their obligations. Omerta. The code of silence made prosecution difficult. When witnesses won't testify and members won't cooperate, even obvious criminals can't be convicted. Corruption. The ability to corrupt police, judges, and politicians provided protection and advance warning of investigations. Violence. The credible threat of murder assured cooperation and discouraged competition. People paid because they feared the alternative. Market demand. The families succeeded because they provided goods and services people wanted. Gambling. Drugs, prostitution, prohibition created opportunities. Human vice sustained them. Ethnic solidarity. The early families benefited from tight-knit Italian, immigrant communities where cultural ties and distrust of authorities provided cover. Business skill. The successful bosses understood profit and loss. Risk and reward. They were criminals, but they were also businessmen who understood their markets. If the families were so successful, why did they decline? Multiple factors contributed. RICO, the legal tool that allowed enterprise prosecution, fundamentally changed the risk-reward calculation of organized crime. Being a boss became genuinely dangerous. Technology, wiretaps, surveillance cameras, and electronic monitoring made operating secretly far more difficult. The family's traditional security measures couldn't adapt fast enough. The breaking of omerta. Once some members cooperated, others followed. The code of silence that had protected the mafia for decades collapsed within a generation. Law enforcement commitment. The FBI's decision to make organized crime a priority, combined with aggressive federal prosecutors, created relentless pressure that previous generations of mobsters never faced. Generational change. Younger Italian Americans had opportunities their grandparents lacked. The talented and ambitious could seed legally, leaving the mafia with less skilled recruits. Internal violence. The family's constant wars with each other weakened them and attracted law enforcement attention. They were often their own worst enemies. Competition. The monopoly the families once enjoyed disappeared as other ethnic organized crime groups moved into traditional mafia markets. Publicity. Ironically, the cultural fascination with the mafia made it harder for mobsters to operate. John Gotti's celebrity status made him a target. The days when bosses could operate in comfortable anonymity were gone. In 2025, the five families exist but are diminished. They're no longer the dominant force in New York's underworld and no longer control entire industries. But they haven't disappeared entirely. They continue operating traditional rackets on a reduced scale. They maintain some union control, particularly in construction and waste management. They run gambling and loan sharking operations. They've adapted to new technologies and new criminal opportunities. Most importantly, they maintain the organizational structure and cultural identity that has defined them for nearly a century. Young men are still inducted with blood oaths and burning saints. Captains still report to bosses. The commission, though weakened, still exists in some form. Whether the five families will exist in another decade is uncertain. Each new prosecution, each new cooperating witness, each new generation that chooses legitimate opportunities over criminal ones moves them closer to extinction. But organized crime itself won't disappear. As long as there's demand for illegal goods and services, someone will supply them. The specific organizations may change. The mafia gave way to Russian criminals who compete with Albanian gangs who share markets with Mexican cartels. But the fundamental dynamics remain at its core. The story of the five families is about the American dream, but a twisted, corrupted version. The Italian immigrants who came to America in the late 1800s and early 1900s were seeking the same things. All immigrants seek opportunity, prosperity, safety for their families. Most achieve these goals through hard work, education, and integration into American society. But some, facing prejudice, poverty, and limited opportunities, chose a different path. They brought old world traditions of honor, loyalty, and violence and applied them to American conditions. They built organizations that enriched themselves at the expense of others. They achieved wealth and power, but through crime rather than legitimate enterprise. The mafia bosses saw themselves as businessmen and civic leaders. Carlo Gambino lived modestly and donated to charity. Joe Bonanno wrote about honor and tradition. Paul Castellano considered himself a legitimate businessman. They rationalized their crimes as merely taking advantage of opportunities that American capitalism made available, but they weren't businessmen. They were criminals who used violence, intimidation, and corruption to achieve their goals. Their success came at enormous cost to individuals, communities, and society. The real American dream, that anyone can succeed through hard work and merit, was actually achieved by the millions of Italian Americans who built legitimate lives and businesses. The mobsters were parasites on that success, exploiting ethnic solidarity while contributing nothing but violence and corruption. What lessons does the story of the five families offer? Organized crime thrives on prohibition and regulation. Prohibition created the mafia's golden age. Drug prohibition sustained them for decades. When governments ban products people want, they create black markets that criminals exploit. Corruption is corrosive. The mafia's ability to corrupt police, judges, and politicians allowed it to operate with impunity for decades. Strong institutions and ethical leadership are essential defenses against organized crime. Cultural factors matter. Omerta, ethnic solidarity, and codes of honor provided the mafia with advantages that other criminal organizations lacked. Understanding cultural factors is essential to combating organized crime. Law enforcement persistence pays off. The FBI's campaign against the mafia, sustained over decades, eventually succeeded. But it required resources, political will, and innovative legal tools like RICO. Organizations adapt. The mafia survived for decades by adapting to changing conditions. Any strategy against organized crime must anticipate adaptation and counter-adaptation. Mythology matters. The romantic portrayal of the mafia in popular culture helped recruit new members and hid the reality of organized crime. How society thinks about criminals affects both recruitment and public policy. And so ends the saga of New York's five families, an empire built on blood, maintained through fear, and ultimately brought down by betrayal from within. From the streets of Sicily to the penthouses of Manhattan, from the wine cellars of Prohibition to the concrete jungles of modern New York, this was organized crime's greatest experiment and greatest failure. The empire that Lucky Luciano built, that Carlo Gambino perfected, and that John Gotti personified no longer exists in its original form. The days when five families controlled the city, when the Commission's word was law, when omerta was unbreakable, those days are gone, but the shadow remains. In the social clubs of Brooklyn and Queens, older men still gather. Some are made members of diminished families, clinging to fading glory. Some are associates hoping for opportunities that will never come. They maintain the rituals, speak the old language, and remember when the five families ruled New York in courtrooms across the city. Prosecutors still bring RICO cases against mobsters. The charges are familiar: gambling, loan sharking, extortion. The names change, but the crimes remain the same. Each new indictment prompts news articles with variations on the same headline. Mafia arrests show mobs still active, despite decades of prosecution. In popular culture, the fascination endures. New movies and television shows continually revisit the mafia era. Each generation finds its own meaning in these stories of ambition, loyalty, and betrayal. The real mobsters fade, but their mythological counterparts grow stronger. And in the streets of New York, the city the five families once controlled, life goes on. The neighborhoods where shootings once occurred regularly are now safe and expensive. The social clubs that served as headquarters are mostly gone, replaced by expensive condos and trendy restaurants. The young people walking past have no idea that beneath their feet, the five families once built an invisible empire. History moves on, but it leaves traces, the five families' story. Their rise from immigrant poverty to criminal empire. Their decades of dominance, their eventual fall, is now part of New York's history, inseparable from the city's identity. It's a story of how ordinary people can create extraordinary criminal organizations, of how tradition and loyalty can sustain institutions across generations, of how even the most powerful organizations eventually fall when internal corruption meets external pressure. It's a story about America itself, about immigration and assimilation, about the gap between law and morality, about the eternal tension between order and freedom. The five families were a uniquely American phenomenon, possible only in a country of immigrants, opportunity, and loose regulation, most importantly. It's a story with real consequences. Behind the romanticized portrayals and the dramatic headlines were real victims. Thousands of them, families destroyed by violence, businesses ruined by extortion, communities corrupted by organized crime's presence. The five families are diminished but not dead, weakened but not destroyed. A few hundred maid members remain, still operating traditional rackets, still maintaining the old structure, still hoping to revive past glory. They won't succeed. The world has changed too much. Law enforcement is too sophisticated. Alternative opportunities are too abundant. The code of silence has been broken too many times to be restored. But they will endure a while longer, a shadow of a shadow, an echo of an empire, a reminder of when five names ruled New York. If you've made it this far in our journey through the shadows, you're part of a special community of people who appreciate the complexity of history. How criminals can be cunning and charismatic even while being destructive. How organizations can be both sophisticated and brutal. How the past shapes the present in unexpected ways. Let us know in the comments which family story fascinated you most. Which boss do you think was the most brilliant? What surprised you most about this history? We read every comment and love hearing your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into true crime history. Hit that like button if you enjoyed this complete look at La Cosa Nostra, and share this with anyone who loves real history told completely and honestly. The story of the five families is ultimately a cautionary tale about the limits of power built on violence. They rose high and ruled long, but they could not escape the consequences of their choices. Their empire, built without legal foundation, could not withstand legal assault. Their strength, built on fear and silence, crumbled when fear faded and silence broke. They wanted to be remembered as men of honor instead. They're remembered as criminals who damaged their communities and betrayed the very values they claimed to uphold. History judges harshly. The five families built an empire in the shadows. And in the shadows it remains, a dark chapter in American history. A fascinating subject of study, and a reminder that all empires, even criminal ones, eventually fall. Until next time, sleep well, and remember, some empires never truly die, they just fade into legend, leaving behind stories that echo through generations. Warnings wrapped in entertainment, lessons hidden in narratives. The five families' shadow is fading, but it will never entirely disappear. It's woven too deeply into New York's fabric, too embedded in American culture, and perhaps that's fitting. Every civilization has its underworld, its shadow side. The five families were ours. Uniquely American, distinctly New York, and utterly unforgettable. Their story is over, but the fascination continues, and in that fascination lies both danger and opportunity. Danger that we romanticize what should repulse us. Opportunity that we learn from history's mistakes. The final lesson of the five families is perhaps the simplest. Power built on crime is built on sand. It may stand for decades, it may seem invincible, but it will eventually collapse. The only question is how much damage it does before it falls. New York survived the five families. The city they once controlled thrives without them, and that, perhaps more than their criminal achievements or their dramatic downfalls, is the most important part of their story. They were powerful, they were clever, they endured for nearly a century. But they lost, and the city moved on.